The stage lights had always loved him. They clung to him the way dusk clings to the edge of the desert sky, soft and golden and forgiving. For decades, whenever he stepped into their glow, the world felt easier. The music floated, the laughter rolled like gentle thunder, and the weight of the world slipped quietly beneath the velvet curtains of the night. To the audience, he was effortless charm wrapped in a tuxedo, glass in hand, smile tilted just enough to suggest he knew something everyone else didn't. But on this particular evening in Las Vegas, something felt different. It wasn't obvious at first. The orchestra played with its usual smooth rhythm. The crowd buzzed with expectation. Couples leaned toward each other, whispering about old songs and younger memories. They had come to see a legend. They had come to feel timeless. When he walked onto the stage, the applause rose exactly as it always had. He gave them the grin. He lifted the glass. He delivered the first joke with the same slow, confident rhythm that had made him beloved across generations. The room responded with laughter, warm and loyal. Yet beneath the music and the polished timing, there was a silence that only he could hear. It wasn't the silence of the audience. It was the silence inside himself. He had lived much of his life beneath applause. Applause had become the language of approval, the measure of worth, the reassurance that everything was fine. But applause fades quickly once you step off stage. It cannot follow you into the dressing room. It cannot sit beside you in the quiet of a late hotel suite. It cannot hold your hand when the memories come. And lately, the memories had been coming more often. He sang the next song with his usual smooth tone, but his eyes lingered on the crowd longer than usual. He watched faces, young, old, hopeful, nostalgic. He wondered how many of them were carrying burdens behind their smiles. He wondered how many were pretending to be lighter than they felt. He knew something about pretending. For years, the persona had protected him. The easygoing entertainer, the relaxed crooner who seemed untouched by disappointment, the man who made everything look simple. It was easier to be that man than to explain the complexity of the real one. Because the real one felt deeply. The real one carried regrets. The real one sometimes felt tired. Not tired of singing, not tired of performing, but tired of carrying the expectation that he was never supposed to struggle. Icons, after all, were not meant to falter. Legends were meant to glide. But he had learned something over time that the crowd did not see. Legends are still human. Midway through the set, he paused longer than usual before a joke. The room quieted. It was a subtle pause, so subtle that most wouldn't notice. But those who knew him closely would have felt it. He adjusted his tie slightly and looked out again, not at the lights this time, but past them into the dim outlines of faces. "I was thinking," he began slowly, his voice softer than his stage voice, "about how funny it is we all come here to forget something." A few chuckles, they thought it was part of the act. "But maybe," he continued, "sometimes it's okay to remember." The orchestra remained still. The audience leaned in. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished. It was real. And that is when the mask shifted, just slightly. He didn't confess secrets. He didn't share dramatic revelations. Instead, he told a simple story about being young and uncertain, about not knowing if he would ever make it, about standing in small clubs where only a handful of people listened. He spoke about doubt, not as something shameful, but as something human. "People think," he said with a faint smile, "that if you make it to the big stage, you stop being afraid. That's not true. You just get better at hiding it." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was understanding. In that moment, something subtle but powerful happened in the room. The distance between icon and audience narrowed. The legend became a man again, and the man, in that vulnerability, became something even greater. Because authenticity carries a different kind of weight than perfection. Backstage, a familiar television host, another giant of the era, watched from the wings. He had known him long enough to sense the shift. He had seen him in interviews, in rehearsals, in private conversations. He understood the armor entertainers wear. He also knew how rare it was for that armor to loosen in front of thousands. When the set ended, the applause returned in full force. The audience rose to their feet. They had been entertained, but they had also been moved in a way they couldn't fully explain. He bowed slightly as always. He exited as always. But the energy backstage was quieter. The host approached him gently. "You okay?" he asked. He nodded with that familiar half-smile. "Yeah," he said, "just thinking." Thinking had become more frequent lately. Thinking about time, thinking about legacy, thinking about what remained when the lights dimmed. They sat for a moment without speaking. The noise of the casino floor filtered faintly through the hallway. It felt oddly distant. "You know," the host finally said, "people don't just come for the jokes." He glanced up. "They come because they see themselves in you. They always have." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, hands that had held microphones for decades, hands that had gestured through punchlines, hands that had waved to countless crowds. He realized something then. For years, he had believed his role was to distract people from their struggles. But perhaps his greater gift was reminding them that even those on stage have struggles too. That night, long after the crowd dispersed and the neon lights flickered outside, he remained in his dressing room longer than usual. He removed the tuxedo jacket slowly. He set the glass aside. He stared at his reflection without the stage lighting softening his features. The face looking back at him wasn't flawless. It was lined with experience. It carried laughter, yes, but also endurance. He did not feel defeated. He felt honest. And honesty, he realized, was more powerful than charm. Across town, conversations were already happening. Audience members told friends that something about the show had felt different. They couldn't articulate it clearly. They just knew they had left feeling lighter, not because they had escaped reality, but because they had felt seen. Two icons had spent years perfecting their masks, one on stage, one behind a desk interviewing the world's biggest stars. But that night marked the beginning of something quieter and deeper. A recognition that strength does not come from appearing unshakable. It comes from admitting you are human. As he stepped outside into the desert air, the city hummed around him. The night sky stretched wide and dark above the electric glow. For the first time in a long while, he felt no pressure to perform, no need to be larger than life. He simply stood there, breathing. There would be more shows, more laughter, more applause. But something had shifted. The mask had not fallen dramatically. It had softened. And in that softening, he discovered a truth that would guide the next chapter of his life. The most enduring legacy is not perfection. It is authenticity. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the moment when two icons slowly began to understand that their greatest influence would not come from the spotlight, but from the courage to step out of it, even briefly, and let the world see who they truly were. And the world, it turned out, was ready for that. The morning after that show arrived without fanfare. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the hotel suite, softer than the stage lights, yet somehow more revealing. He had always preferred the night. Night allowed a man to be whoever he needed to be. Morning demanded something quieter. It asked for honesty before the armor had time to settle back into place. He sat at a small table near the window, coffee untouched, staring out at the Las Vegas Strip that looked far less glamorous in daylight. Neon signs, so dazzling at midnight, now appeared tired and exposed. The illusion had faded with the dark. He felt an unexpected kinship with the scene before him. The magic of performance had its time, but daylight had a way of stripping away decoration and leaving only truth. He replayed the previous evening in his mind, not the laughter, not the applause, but that pause, that unplanned confession. He had not intended to let the audience glimpse behind the curtain, yet something within him had insisted. It had not been dramatic or reckless. It had been gentle, and that gentleness had startled him more than any grand revelation could have. For decades, he had perfected effortlessness. He had built a reputation on smoothness and composure. Vulnerability had never been part of the script. Later that afternoon, he met the television host who had watched from the wings. They chose a quiet corner in a small restaurant away from flashing cameras and curious eyes. Their conversations had always been layered, humor on the surface, deeper currents underneath. This time, the surface jokes faded quickly. They spoke about time, about the strange weight that comes with longevity in an industry that constantly reinvents itself. They spoke about how the public sees only what fits the myth, and rarely the man beneath it. The host admitted something he had never said publicly. "There are nights," he confessed, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, "when I go home after interviewing the biggest stars in the world and feel completely invisible." It was not envy. It was not bitterness. It was a quiet recognition that fame does not guarantee fulfillment. The studio lights might illuminate faces, but they cannot illuminate purpose. He listened carefully, For years, the world had seen these two men as symbols of confidence. They were the ones who guided the room, who controlled the tempo of laughter, who appeared unshakable. Yet here they were, discussing uncertainty like two old friends comparing weather reports. There was no competition in their honesty, only relief. The conversation turned toward legacy. Not awards or headlines, but impact. What remains when the curtain closes for good? He admitted that lately he had been thinking less about the number of performances and more about the meaning of them. Did the songs comfort someone? Did the jokes ease a burden for even a few minutes? Did the honesty of that pause the previous night offer permission for someone else to drop their own mask, even briefly? The host leaned back and studied him with a thoughtful expression. "You know what people remember most?" he asked. "Not the perfect performance. They remember the moment they felt connected." The words lingered in the air between them. Connection. That was the currency that never depreciated. As the weeks passed, something subtle began to change in his performances. He still delivered the humor, still sang with that smooth confidence, but there were more pauses now, more stories woven into the set. Not grand confessions, but reflections about youth, about risk, about friendship, about loss. The audience responded differently. The laughter remained, but it was joined by a deeper attentiveness. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants in something more human. Behind the scenes, however, he confronted realities he had long postponed. The industry was evolving. Younger performers were emerging with new styles, new energy, new ways of engaging audiences. He could have responded with resistance. Many did. Instead, he felt a surprising calm. He did not need to compete with youth. He had something youth did not yet possess, perspective. And perspective, he was beginning to understand, was a gift. One evening, after another sold-out show, he lingered backstage with a small group of crew members. These were the people who rarely received applause yet made every performance possible. He asked them about their families, their dreams, their worries. It was not an act of charity or performance. It was curiosity, genuine curiosity. And in those quiet conversations, he discovered stories far more compelling than any scripted monologue. A lighting technician supporting aging parents. A stagehand saving for his daughter's education. A young musician terrified of not being good enough. Their honesty mirrored his own unspoken fears. The spotlight had never truly separated him from them. It had only created the illusion of distance. Meanwhile, the host began to incorporate subtle changes into his show as well. Interviews became less about promoting projects and more about exploring experiences. He asked guests about setbacks, about doubt, about the moments that shaped them. Viewers noticed. Ratings did not suffer. In fact, they grew. Audiences were hungry for authenticity, even if they could not articulate it. The two icons began to share a quiet understanding. Their careers had been built on polish, but their influence was expanding through vulnerability. Neither of them made grand announcements about transformation. There were no press releases about a new direction. The change unfolded naturally, like a season shifting without ceremony. One night, during a particularly reflective performance, he addressed the audience with a sincerity that would have startled his younger self. He spoke about the pressure to appear strong all the time. He admitted that even those who seem confident sometimes wrestle with doubt. He did not dwell on personal hardship, nor did he dramatize struggle. Instead, he framed vulnerability as courage. "It takes more strength," he said softly, "to admit you're human than to pretend you're not." The room fell silent in a way that felt sacred. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just attentive. He realized then that the spotlight did not have to be a shield. It could be a bridge. It could illuminate shared humanity rather than obscure it. After the show, letters began arriving, not from industry executives or critics, but from ordinary people. A widow who said his words helped her feel less alone in her grief. A young man who said hearing an icon speak about doubt gave him permission to pursue his dream without shame. A father who realized that being honest with his children about his fears made him a better role model, not a weaker one. These letters mattered more than any review. The host, too, received messages. Viewers thanked him for asking deeper questions, for allowing silence, for not rushing past meaningful answers in pursuit of punchlines. He confided that he felt lighter, less burdened by the need to maintain constant wit. The mask had not been malicious. It had been protective, but protection can become isolation if worn too long. Their friendship deepened through these shared revelations. They were no longer simply entertainers navigating a demanding industry. They were men reconsidering what strength truly meant. They spoke openly now about fear of aging, about the fragility of reputation, about the inevitability of change. Instead of resisting these realities, they faced them together. There were still glamorous nights, still tuxedos, still applause that rolled like thunder, but beneath it all ran a new current of peace. He no longer felt compelled to hide behind effortlessness. Effort had shaped him. Vulnerability had refined him, and the combination felt far more powerful than charm alone. One late evening, standing again under the vast desert sky, he reflected on how strange it was that dropping the mask had not diminished his legacy but strengthened it. The myth had not shattered. It had matured. The audience did not love him less for his honesty. They loved him more. He understood now that resilience is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It quietly endures, quietly adapts, quietly grows. The human spirit does not need perfection to inspire others. It needs truth. As the city lights flickered behind him, he felt gratitude, not for fame, not for applause, but for the realization that authenticity could coexist with greatness. The spotlight might still follow him, but it no longer defined him. What defined him was the courage to let it reveal, rather than conceal, who he truly was. And this transformation was only beginning. The months that followed did not unfold with dramatic headlines or sudden upheaval. There was no scandal, no abrupt farewell, no grand reinvention announced to the world. Instead, change crept in the way dawn replaces night, steadily, almost imperceptibly, until the landscape looks entirely different. For a man who had lived most of his life in the brilliance of artificial light, this slower illumination felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. He had spent decades mastering timing, tone, posture, presence. Now he found himself studying something far less predictable, the state of his own heart. There is a particular kind of silence that settles in a theater after the audience has gone home. It is not empty, it carries echoes. That silence became his unexpected teacher. On several evenings after the final encore and the customary waves, he chose not to leave immediately. Instead, he would sit alone in the front row, jacket folded neatly beside him, staring at the stage where he had just stood. The boards looked smaller from the audience's perspective. The microphone stand appeared less imposing. He began to understand how much perspective changes power. From the stage, he had always looked outward. From the seats, he now looked inward. He began thinking about the years that had shaped him. The hunger of early ambition, the nights of uncertainty, the risks taken when there was no guarantee of applause. Back then, resilience had been survival. Now, resilience meant something else. It meant adapting without bitterness. It meant accepting change without fear. It meant acknowledging that even icons must eventually confront the simple truth that time moves forward, not backward. In conversations with his longtime friend, the television host, this theme surfaced again and again. They spoke about aging not as decline, but as transition. They acknowledged the quiet fear of becoming irrelevant in a culture obsessed with novelty. Yet they also recognized something freeing. Relevance is not always measured by headlines. It is often measured by depth. One afternoon, during a break between rehearsals, they found themselves in a candid exchange that neither would have imagined years earlier. The host admitted that he sometimes felt trapped by expectation. "People think I have to be sharp every second," he said thoughtfully. "If I pause too long, they think something's wrong." He smiled faintly, but there was truth beneath it. The persona had been built carefully, brick by brick. To step outside, it felt risky. He nodded in understanding. "People think I don't feel anything," he replied quietly, "like I just float through life." He looked down at his hands again, the same hands that had once trembled before small crowds in obscure clubs. "They don't know how much I've felt." That admission marked another subtle shift. For years, the public narrative had been simple: charm, ease, humor. But behind that simplicity was a man who had navigated friendship, heartbreak, pressure, and loss with the same intensity as anyone else. The difference was that he had learned to compress those experiences into performance rather than display them openly. Now he was decompressing. It happened gradually during shows. Instead of rushing through familiar routines, he lingered. Instead of deflecting with humor at the first sign of seriousness, he allowed certain moments to breathe. Audiences noticed. They sensed maturity in the pacing, gravity in the storytelling. The laughter still came, but it was layered with something richer. The jokes felt less like shields and more like bridges. One evening, a young performer visited Backstage. He had grown up idolizing him, memorizing songs, imitating mannerisms. The young man confessed nervously that he felt constant pressure to appear confident, to never show weakness. "If they see doubt," he said, "they'll think I don't belong." He listened carefully, recognizing his younger self in that fear. He did not offer cliches. Instead, he shared something simple. Belonging doesn't come from pretending, it comes from staying. The young performer looked puzzled at first, so he elaborated. If you stay long enough, through doubt, through mistakes, through the nights that don't go perfectly, you'll discover that honesty lasts longer than perfection. The advice was not flashy, it was not packaged for applause, but it was sincere. And sincerity, he had learned, carries quiet authority. As the year unfolded, he found himself reflecting not just on career, but on relationships. Fame has a way of distorting connection. People approach with admiration, expectation, sometimes even projection. Genuine friendship becomes rare and precious. His bond with the television host had endured precisely because it was built on shared understanding rather than spectacle. They had seen each other at their best and at their most uncertain. That mutual witness created trust. One night, after a particularly introspective performance, they walked together along a quiet stretch behind the venue. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but the space around them felt almost rural in its stillness. The host turned to him and asked a question that lingered long after it was spoken. Do you ever wish you could go back and do it differently? He did not answer immediately. The past is tempting terrain. It offers both nostalgia and regret. Finally, he shook his head gently. No, he said, because I wouldn't have understood this. He gestured vaguely, not to the stage, not to the lights, but to the present moment. You can't skip the learning. That realization anchored him. The earlier years of deflection and polish had not been mistakes, they had been necessary chapters. The mask had served its purpose. It had protected, propelled, and sustained him. But growth required evolution, and evolution required courage. Courage, he discovered, does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, urging a man to sit quietly with his own thoughts rather than drown them in distraction. Sometimes it invites him to admit fatigue without surrendering purpose. Sometimes it asks him to redefine success not by applause, but by authenticity. During a nationally televised appearance, something remarkable occurred. Midway through the conversation, the host asked him what he was most proud of. Years earlier, he might have listed achievements, milestones, collaborations. Instead, he paused thoughtfully and said, I'm proud that I stayed myself even when I didn't fully understand who that was yet. The audience responded with unexpected warmth. There was no punchline, no flourish, just honesty. The clip circulated widely, not because it was sensational, but because it felt real. Viewers saw a man comfortable enough in his legacy to admit complexity. Younger audiences, who had not grown up with his early fame, began discovering him not just as a performer, but as a thinker. Older fans felt validated, as if the evolution mirrored their own journeys through decades of change. Behind the scenes, he continued practicing a quieter discipline: gratitude. Each letter from a fan, each handshake from a crew member, each sincere conversation reinforced his understanding that influence extends beyond performance. The resilience of the human spirit is often sparked by small acknowledgments rather than grand gestures. He began dedicating subtle moments in his shows to themes of kindness and perseverance. He would recount stories of people he had met, ordinary individuals facing extraordinary challenges with dignity. He framed these stories not as tragedies, but as testimonies of strength. Audiences listened with deep attention. They saw themselves in those narratives. They left not merely entertained, but encouraged. The transformation was not about abandoning humor or glamour. It was about integrating depth into both. The tuxedos still fit. The microphone still gleamed. But the man wearing them stood differently. There was less urgency to impress, more intention to connect. One evening, sitting alone once more in the now familiar front row after a show, he realized that the quiet reckoning he had feared had become a source of peace. The questions about relevance, aging, and authenticity had not diminished him. They had refined him. He no longer viewed vulnerability as exposure. He viewed it as invitation. The spotlight, once heavy with expectation, felt lighter now because it no longer had to conceal. It could reveal. And revelation, when guided by sincerity, strengthens rather than weakens. As he rose from the seat and walked toward the stage one last time before leaving the empty theater, he placed his hand briefly on the microphone stand. It was not a dramatic gesture. No one was there to witness it. But in that moment, he felt gratitude for the journey, from polished illusion to grounded authenticity. The reckoning behind the curtain had not been an ending. It had been a renewal. And the story was still unfolding. Time has a way of turning moments into meaning long after the applause fades. The transformation that had begun quietly in reflective pauses and late-night conversations eventually settled into something permanent. It was no longer a phase or a subtle shift in tone. It had become the foundation of who he was, on stage, off stage, and everywhere in between. The charm was still there. The wit still landed. The songs still carried that unmistakable smoothness. But beneath it all was a steadiness that had not existed in earlier years. It was the steadiness of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. The shows continued, but they felt different in a way that was difficult to measure and impossible to ignore. Audiences arrived expecting the legend and left remembering the man. That difference mattered. He no longer rushed through sets as if racing against time. Instead, he allowed silence to share space with sound. He let stories stretch a little longer. He acknowledged the passage of years without apology. When he spoke about perseverance, it was not abstract, it was lived. When he spoke about kindness, it carried the weight of experience. And when he smiled, it no longer felt like a performance reflex, it felt genuine. Behind the scenes, he simplified his life. The entourage shrank. The schedule became more intentional. He chose engagements that felt meaningful rather than merely impressive. The world had once measured success by visibility, but he began measuring it by impact. A private conversation with a struggling musician mattered as much as a standing ovation. A quiet note from a fan carried as much weight as a glowing review. The metrics had changed, and in changing them, he found freedom. His longtime friend, the television host, mirrored this evolution in his own sphere. Interviews grew deeper, more reflective. Moments of vulnerability were no longer edited out for fear of slowing the pace. Viewers sensed authenticity and responded with loyalty rather than criticism. Together, the two men had unknowingly initiated a subtle cultural shift. They had shown that strength and sincerity could coexist without diminishing either. They had proven that resilience is not loud bravado but steady endurance. One evening, during a special televised event honoring his career, he stood before a crowd that included fellow performers, industry veterans, and ordinary fans whose lives had intersected with his music in unseen ways. Tributes were offered. Clips from decades past played across large screens. Laughter erupted at familiar jokes. Applause thundered after iconic songs. It was everything a celebration of legacy should be. Yet when he finally approached the microphone, the room quieted in anticipation of something polished and charming. Instead, he offered gratitude without embellishment. He spoke about the early days of uncertainty, about the friends who stood beside him when there were no guarantees, about the audiences who returned year after year. He admitted that he had once believed his job was simply to entertain. Over time, he realized it was to connect. "If I've done anything worthwhile," he said gently, "I hope it's that I reminded you that we're all human, even the ones under the lights." There was no grand crescendo, no dramatic flourish, just sincerity, and the sincerity carried more power than any elaborate speech could have delivered. In that moment, the myth of invincibility dissolved entirely, not as a collapse, but as a release. The mask was no longer necessary because the man beneath it had earned the right to stand without it. As years passed, his presence on stage became less frequent but more cherished. Each appearance felt intentional. Each song carried layers of memory. Audiences who had grown older alongside him recognized themselves in his evolution. They too had once worn masks, at work, in relationships, in moments of fear. They too had learned that authenticity demands courage. Watching him embrace that courage encouraged them to do the same. In private life, he cultivated quiet routines. Morning walks replaced late-night excess. Conversations replaced spectacle. Reflection replaced restlessness. He found peace in ordinary rhythms, sunlight through curtains, the steady ticking of a clock, the simple comfort of unguarded laughter shared with close friends. The applause had once defined his sense of completion. Now completion came from integrity. He often revisited the memory of that first pause, the night the laughter softened and truth slipped gently into the spotlight. That moment had not been planned. It had not been strategic. It had simply been honest, and honesty had proven stronger than performance. The courage to reveal uncertainty had not weakened his legacy. It had strengthened it in ways that applause alone never could. Toward the later chapter of his life, when invitations became fewer and public appearances rarer, he did not resist the shift. He understood seasons. He understood that influence does not vanish when visibility fades. It transforms. Younger artists cited him not only for his talent, but for his authenticity. Fans spoke of how his words about doubt had given them permission to pursue dreams without shame. Parents recalled sharing his music with children, not just for nostalgia, but for the lessons woven into his later performances about empathy and perseverance. The resilience of the human spirit reveals itself most clearly in transitions. It is easy to be bold at the height of acclaim. It is more challenging to be steady when the pace slows. Yet he navigated that slowing with grace. He did not cling to the spotlight. He stepped away from it when the time felt right, carrying with him the knowledge that the brightest illumination he had offered was not the stage lighting but the example of humility. In quiet moments of reflection, he recognized that the mask had never been an enemy. It had been a tool, useful in certain seasons, protective when necessary. But tools are not identities. Identity rests deeper, rooted in character rather than performance. When the mask finally became a memory rather than a necessity, he felt lighter, not diminished, not forgotten, simply aligned. The friendship with the television host endured through changing circumstances. They laughed about old stories, about awkward interviews, about nights when jokes missed their mark. They also acknowledged the deeper journey they had shared, two men learning that vulnerability is not weakness but strength refined. Their bond stood as quiet testimony that authenticity strengthens relationships rather than threatening them. Long after the final curtain fell and the stages grew still, his influence continued to ripple outward. Music has a way of carrying emotion across generations. Stories travel even further. In living rooms, on late-night reruns, in shared playlists between parents and children, the legacy lived on. Not just the smooth voice or the effortless humor, but the moment when an icon chose to be human. In the end, the true measure of a life is not applause. It is impact. It is the courage to evolve. It is the willingness to admit uncertainty and still move forward. His journey from polished persona to authentic presence reflected a universal truth. Every human being wears a mask at some point. The challenge is not avoiding it entirely. The challenge is knowing when to set it down. The night the mask softened marked the beginning of that awareness. The years that followed proved its power. And when the mask finally became a memory, what remained was something far more enduring, a legacy built not only on talent but on truth. The spotlight eventually dims for everyone, but authenticity, once embraced, does not fade. It echoes quietly in the lives it has touched.